Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier M. Fouché pour cette remarquable introduction. Ensuite, j'ai le plaisir et la responsabilité d'être le modérateur de la 3e table ronde dans le cadre de l'édition Sofia et Plovdiv des dialogues européens, dans laquelle nous allons discuter des impératifs et des défis de l'élargissement de l'Union européenne vers l'Europe du Sud-Est. Aujourd'hui, dans cette table ronde, ensemble avec moi, sont Dimitris Christopoulos, professeur en sciences politiques de l'Université Panthéon de Grèce, Clotilde Varin, chercheuse chargée des affaires européennes au Centre d'analyse, de prévision et de stratégie du ministère de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères de la République française, Julian Groza, directeur de l'Institut des politiques et des réformes européennes à Chisinau, en Moldavie, et Besa Lucci, qui est rédactrice en chef du magazine multimédia Kosovo 2 de Kosovo. Avec eux, nous allons essayer, lors de cette table ronde, de trouver la réponse d'une question centrale. Est-ce que, après avoir joué efficacement pendant plus de 60 ans, son rôle principal de garantir la paix durable et le progrès en Europe, l'intégration européenne peut également être ce facteur déterminant de stabilité et du développement pour l'Europe du Sud-Est, permettant l'adhésion de nouveaux membres de la région, surtout dans le contexte de la guerre qui est revenue sur le continent européen. Pour répondre à cette question centrale, je pense que nous devons essayer de réfléchir sur les principaux facteurs qui déterminent le processus d'élargissement vers l'Europe du Sud-Est et sur les défis spécifiques auxquels nous sommes confrontés. Nous avons décidé d'approcher cette problématique d'une approche un peu plus différente. Nous avons divisé notre table ronde en deux parties. Donc une première partie qui sera plutôt ciblée sur le contexte politique, sur la particularité de la situation de l'Europe du Sud-Est et les complexités qui existent entre les pays de la région. Et une deuxième partie qui est plutôt ciblée sur les défis spécifiques liés au modèle démocratique, à l'état de droit, aux problèmes de lutte contre la corruption dans la région. Dans la première partie, il y a quelques questions que nos intervenants allons traiter. La première question concerne donc quelle est la perspective du futur élargissement dans le contexte de la guerre en Ukraine. Ensuite, vu l'existence, disons, des tendances, des sentiments assez fortes pro-russes dans certains pays de l'Europe du Sud-Est, comment l'éventuelle adhésion de nouveaux pays de la région va résulter dans le fonctionnement de l'Union européenne. Est-ce qu'on pourra consolider l'Union européenne? Est-ce qu'on pourra avoir une politique étrangère et de sécurité commune qui est plus efficace, donc qui répond aux nécessités dans la région, en Europe et sur le plan global? Est-ce qu'on ne doit pas penser pour une réforme du cadre institutionnel de la politique étrangère et de sécurité commune avant de procéder à la réalisation de l'élargissement de l'Union vers l'Europe du Sud-Est? Mais aussi, comment on doit affronter la complexité historique, les différends encore existants entre certains des États membres de l'Union européenne et des États candidats, donc un problème qui a été déjà mentionné aujourd'hui, les différends qui existent malheureusement toujours entre la Macédoine du Nord et la Grèce, la Macédoine du Nord et la Bulgarie, Kosovo et la Serbie, et la complexité de la Bosnie-Herzégovine. Et bien sûr, comme on est au lendemain des élections européennes, finalement, avec cette situation plus ou moins compliquée qui résulte des élections, comment on voit l'opinion publique européenne sur les questions relatives à l'élargissement. Donc, quel est le soutien, ou est-ce qu'il y a des déficits sur le plan de soutien public pour l'élargissement? Ce sont les questions que nous allons traiter dans la première partie. Donc, peut-être Madame Varin qui peut commencer avec ses réponses.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Je pense que ça va se déclencher. C'est ça? Merci beaucoup, merci pour l'invitation. Je suis très heureuse d'être là. Merci aussi à notamment Luc Lévy qui a œuvré pour toute cette conférence, entre autres. Beaucoup de questions, hein, Risto. Je vais peut-être, pour pas être trop longue, rester un petit peu, parce que je serai très heureuse d'un temps d'échange. Peut-être que je vais parler de cette perspective d'élargissement dans le contexte de l'agression militaire. Il est vrai qu'il y a eu une accélération avec des signaux politiques très forts qui ont été donnés à de nouveaux pays candidats. Je pense à la Moldavie, bien sûr, puisque Julian est mon voisin, à l'Ukraine, bien sûr. Je pense, et je trouve que c'est intéressant de le dire aussi, que... Enfin, je vais parler également des Balkans occidentaux rapidement parce que Viesela, on a un peu parlé ce matin, mais c'est vrai qu'il y a ce moment, on va dire, enfin bon, je vais le dire en 3 points assez brefs, mais il y a une forme de moment d'urgence géostratégique que Michel Fouché a rappelé. Et il est vrai qu'il y avait eu jusqu'à maintenant, et de la part des institutions européennes, un processus qui n'avait pas beaucoup avancé sur les Balkans occidentaux, mais en fait, on est toujours en train de chercher des boucs émissaires. Ce n'était pas que le fait de l'Union européenne, c'était aussi le fait que les réformes n'avançaient pas non plus au sein des États des Balkans occidentaux. Il est vrai aussi, et ça je pense qu'il faut le noter, qu'il y avait des États membres qui étaient un petit peu... et la France en faisait partie, qui étaient un peu considérés comme étant réticents à l'élargissement. Et là aussi, la guerre... ce moment tragique a rebattu les cartes et la France maintenant est un des États membres moteurs de l'élargissement et on pourra y revenir, mais réfléchit sur beaucoup de points et notamment nous à la cellule prospective et stratégie sur ces questions-là. Dans cette urgence qui est maintenant, il y a aussi eu cette volonté, cette nécessité de convergence. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a beaucoup de réflexions aussi sur comment les pays candidats, et moi je le vois pas parce que je sais que ça a été critiqué par exemple dans la précédente table ronde, c'est pas une question de maître à élève, c'est pas une question de on est dans un club et vous deviez y entrer, c'est une question de fonctionnement de l'Union européenne en fait. On a déjà au sein de l'Union européenne un problème avec des États membres qui ne respectent pas les questions d'état de droit. On est une structure hybride dans laquelle cela doit être respecté. Et ça c'est quelque chose de vraiment important. Donc il y a une volonté de convergence. Je prends un seul exemple. Par exemple, pour les pays candidats, il y a une demande dans le contexte de l'agression russe qu'il y ait un alignement sur les paquets de sanctions. Certains pays ne s'alignent pas, on les connaît, mais en tout cas, c'est une volonté. Et je pense que c'est aussi important pour qu'on en arrive à cette convergence. Alors, vous avez posé beaucoup de questions, je vais peut-être rapidement parler de cette question, ce dilemme qui a été longtemps le cas de l'approfondissement et de l'élargissement. C'est un gros mot de dire dilemme, mais en fait, souvent on s'est dit, il y avait les États membres qui étaient pour qu'on approfondisse l'Union européenne telle qu'elle était, et puis il y avait ceux qui voulaient élargir, et même élargir, mais sans qu'on change, et élargir rapidement. Et même le Royaume-Uni faisait partie de ces pays-là. Ce que je trouve qui est très important et qu'il faut avoir en tête, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, ce logiciel, en quelque sorte, a changé. Aujourd'hui, dans ce contexte actuel, on a décidé, dans ce contexte d'urgence, qu'il faudrait un processus parallèle. C'est le protocole de Grenade, hein, ça a été acté à l'automne dernier, et c'est l'idée qu'il faut qu'on avance en même temps sur nos deux jambes, sur élargissement et sur réforme. Donc l'idée c'est pas de renverser la table, c'est pas d'aller, parce que c'est un gros mot pour aussi des États membres, à des changements de traités ou des grandes choses, c'est de se dire qu'est-ce qu'on a et comment on va la rendre plus forte et aussi plus fonctionnelle. Donc après on peut se poser des questions et j'espère qu'il y aura des questions là-dessus, mais comment le faire? Là par exemple, pour vous prendre un exemple, il y a eu une initiative française et allemande et soutenue par 13 autres États membres d'une feuille de route sur l'élargissement et la réforme qui sera là présentée en juin et pour la future commission. Donc pour se dire comment on va mettre ça en place. Donc il y a vraiment des choses qui se mettent en place et rapidement, mais en même temps avec un respect des conditions et notamment des critères de Copenhague qui ont été cités par Michel Fouché. Je vais peut-être m'arrêter là parce que merci beaucoup.
Merci. Professeur Christopoulos.
Merci beaucoup, merci pour l'invitation à l'Institut français. Je vais parler anglais parce que mon anglais me facilite d'être un peu plus simple. So I switch to English, thank you very much again. Last Sunday, the very day of the European elections, I happened to find myself in Patras, which is a town 200 kilometers southwest of Athens, where the international championship of Thailand box was held, because my son, he's working a lot on this nice sport. So I spent one full day in a big stadium watching 1,000 athletes from everywhere in the world. And I noticed, I was following who was running and who took the bronze, the silver, and the gold and medals. And I noticed that there was a country that I did not know, the initial letters of which was INA, I-N-A. So I was thinking, what country is INA, what country is INA? And I heard the speaker saying that golden medal, independent, neutral athlete. Golden medal, independent, neutral athlete. I said, what is happening here? Why we have so many independent, neutral athletes? What are these people? These are stateless people. Of course, these were not stateless people. These were Russian athletes, as I learned afterwards, and they were not called with the name of their country because Russia was, and I think reasonably, expelled by the federation, the International Federation of Muay Thai. So they did not have their flags, they did not have the name of their country, and I thought that that is a good lesson to give to Russia, to expel them from such international championships. But my joy did not last, because afterwards there was an Israeli athlete who got the golden medal, and of course he did not carry the name of INA, but the brand name of his country. And I thought that that is not a good model of showing our ethics when it comes to wars, because there is not one war. This is what I say to some pro-Russian Greeks, because as here in Greece we have many pro-Russians, so when they speak of war, they only mean what is happening in Gaza, then they forget what is happening in Ukraine. So I have to say here before you, do not forget that war is not a singular case today in Europe. And I say Europe, although I know that Palestine is in the Middle East, because we intend, and generally we tend, traditionally, to include the Israeli in all our European contests, including Eurovision, including basketball, etc., etc. So, if we really want to play in a good way and in an effective way when it comes to limit the Russian influence in countries of the Western Balkans where this influence is traditionally high, I think that this is not the correct way to do it. I think that the correct way to move forward is not to apply double standards, because with double standards, countries generally isolate themselves, and instead of, let's say, losing contact with the bad influences, they become more eager to obtain more contact with such bad influences. And the most illustrative example here is North Macedonia. a country with which Greece had all these issues, a country that after the Prespa agreement was blocked by France and Bulgaria in the second phase because of different issues, a country today where we have a revival of a pro-Russian, very brutal nationalism coming from, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, and therefore the whole spirit of Prespa is completely forgotten. So in that sense, I feel that the first advice, if we really want to do something to limit such contaminating, let's say, influences, is to play in a fair way. The second, I think, morale, the second conclusion I draw, and I finish, is that it is better to avoid humiliation of countries and nations. As you all know, and I'm sure that I'm not the first to remind you here, one of the reasons, according to main European historians, that caused the Second World War was the fact that the German Empire was and felt humiliated by the Versailles Treaty. I'm not saying that the only reason for the rise of Nazism and National Socialism is the fact that Entente humiliated the Germans in 1919, but I say, along with other historians, that one of the reasons that guided us, that led us to this, to the most atrocious laboratory of human ideology ever tested in Europe, was the way Germany was treated in 1919. So I think that sometimes the way that the Eastern European countries have been treated after the end of the Cold War by the mainstream European Union North, South, and West countries also had provoked a reasonable sense of humiliation, and this humiliation creates the fertile soil for the revival of the most brutal, barbarian, anachronistic, call them whatever you want, feelings of nationalism. And third, what do we call this nationalism? And that is where I stop. We call it populism. So imagine you're a fascist, and I come to you and I tell you you're a populist. I think you must be very happy if you're a real fascist and someone calls you a populist. I hear what's happening in France today, and I hear people calling Le Pen a populist, and if I was Le Pen, I would be extremely happy if I was labeled a populist by European technocrats. So these are the three conclusions I will draw from this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Bertolucci?
Which question?
The one that you prefer. Perhaps you can also discuss the perception of opinions in Western Balkans and in Kosovo on the way that European Union and European countries are dealing with the enlargement process.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, similarly, I think along the lines of what was just said, because there's this tendency now to think that since the 2022, so since the second invasion of Russia's in Ukraine, that there's this momentum for EU enlargement, and this is also the momentum that's going to help push forward the EU enlargement process towards the Western Balkans. But I think when we make statements like that, we forget that this process started back in 2003 at the Thessaloniki summit, when the commitment was made that the future of the Western Balkans is in the EU, so it's more than two decades later. So when you think of a context of 2 decades later, you're talking about also a lot of generations that have lived, have a particular experience that they have gone through specifically with the EU. And I think that too much, when we talk about the process of enlargement, we tend to think only about the specific reforms that candidate countries need to go through and the homework that they need to finish, but very rarely do we also, and I think we need to change a bit time after time also the framework, and to also think about how also the EU to a large extent, and I think especially with this political strategy, has often perpetuated and also reproduced certain disputes between countries in the region. So it's not only this like idea that countries in the Balkans, you know, have this ancient hatred towards one another that is very difficult to overcome. I think also within the past 2 decades, I think the EU also gets a very share of that responsibility. The case of North Macedonia was mentioned. North Macedonia it got the status of candidate country back in 2005, and it was only 2022 when it officially started negotiation talks with the EU. So also just getting the status of candidate country by itself doesn't really mean that you're coming closer to the EU. So, and I think there's that example. In the case of, for example, specifically Kosovo, of course, the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, which is EU mediated, it's a crucial process for both countries' accession, potential accession into the EU, but also in that regard, there's very often I feel that there's a mixture between what are technical implementation of reforms and what are like the technical conditioning and the political conditioning. And I think the EU really goes back and forth between those two, depending on what it serves its interest in a particular moment of time. And when you do that, of course, that's going to also affect the way that I think societies end up engaging and also relating to the EU itself. So within the framework of the dialogue, I mean, it was very clear from the beginning that the way the dialogue framework was set up, it was between two parties where one party is very much considered unequal towards the other. And there's one party that is continuously expected to make concessions and the other one that is appeased in that process. So the appeasement going particularly towards Vučić in this regard. Just today, finally, there's been a clear statement from the EU. Finally, the dialogue started back in 2011. We are in 2024. And finally, today, we have a statement from the EU that, yes, Serbia is breaching the agreement, that because it agreed that it's not going to stand in the way of Kosovo applying and becoming a member of different international organizations, and it is breaching its promise that it's reaching the promise that it's not going to do that. So finally, we have a statement like that, but sometimes it feels like it's coming a bit too late, because in the meantime, people are losing trust in the EU. Yes, today in the morning session, these numbers were mentioned that around 30 to 40% of people in the countries of the Western Balkans actually believe that they're going to think that they're ever going to join to the EU. But I think actually the framing has to be a bit more differently, because it's only 30% of people in the majority of the countries in the Western Balkans believe that the EU wants them to join the EU. And that is very much different, because people in the Western Balkans, they do see their future within the EU, but they don't think that the EU wants them. So I think, in that context, and in the context of this entire 20 years of experience, where the enlargement, the accession process towards Western Balkan countries is continuously amended, new political conditioning, it's continuously added, people don't see that this is ever going to end necessarily. So I think it's better for the EU to actually be honest and for there to be transparency, and to say, okay, maybe there won't be enlargement for these countries, so let's figure something else out, rather than just keep dragging people with this idea of this hope And hope is actually a very problematic concept, because hope gives you this idea that something is going to change. Like hope gives you this vision that there is a potential change in the future, but because it's in the future, then it also gets you stuck and stagnated in the present. So it's a very dangerous concept in that regard, and that's exactly what the EU does towards the region. So I think it's better to actually just be transparent, so to say, no, it's not going to happen. So let's think of other ways, other frameworks within which cooperation can be set up. And in other ways that it can happen, because the downside of it is that it risks turning people, especially in countries like Kosovo, where it is one of the most pro-EU countries and most pro-US as well, turning them into skeptics, and also turning them against the union, with which I think, especially in Kosovo, people truly feel aligned and want to align with some ideals that were, because I think we can talk later about what are today's values of the EU, because a lot of moments today we're talking about European values, but I think we need to rediscuss what those are, because I don't think there's one homogeneous group of European values today that everybody abides by necessarily.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Mr. Groza.
Merci beaucoup. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier l'Institut français pour l'invitation à participer au dialogue européen à Sofia. Je parle un peu français, mais je préfère donner mes réponses en anglais pour être plus clair. Merci pour votre compréhension. Now I'll continue in English, and I'd like to answer by referring to war and peace, and the future, and the past of the enlargement. First of all, when talking about the enlargement, I think enlargement is one of the most successful policies of the EU. And of course, we have our own experiences about this process, both inside the EU, outside the EU, in particular countries in Western Balkans. We, in Moldova, attempted back in 2003 actually to join the train of enlargement at after the Thessaloniki summit, and we thought that we can enter the EU not maybe through the front door, but maybe through the window. And that was one of the ideas, that we can join the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe. And it happened. Moldova joined Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe, and together with all other Western Balkan countries, Moldova is part of the regional cooperation process, Regional Cooperation Council, CEFTA, CSCP. So Moldova, unlike other countries from Eastern Europe, is participating there for over 20 years now. Of course, we had two differences. We didn't have a European perspective, and we didn't have access to structural funds. Well, this changed 2 years ago. In a week's time, we'll have 2 years since Moldova became candidate country together with Ukraine. And we still don't have access to structural funds, but that will happen back in the future in 2027, 2028. But that's less important now, because I'd like to give you an anecdote, a story. In my previous life, I've been a diplomat, and I was part of the negotiation team that negotiated the association agreement with the European Union. And during the negotiations, we were struggling to get recognition of our European perspective. We, Ukraine, Georgia, we failed to get a consensus among member states, even though many member states have been supporting us. And I remember referring to history while trying to build our arguments. Said, don't wait for a war to start to change your perspective. Well, it happened. 2 years ago, a war started, and the EU has changed its perspective. And this is not something that I invented. This is actually purely history. EU is a peace project as a response to war. It started like that after the Second World War. After the end of the Cold War, we had the start of the Big Bang enlargement. After the last Yugoslav war, we had Thessaloniki summit. And after Russia's aggression, Russia's war against Ukraine, we have another 2 countries in the list of candidates in the Eastern Europe. So EU is always responding to war with the offer of the peace, stability, security, prosperity. So now we are here. I mean, we, together with Western Balkan countries and Ukraine, are part of the enlargement process. And yeah, we had to hear a lot of, statements saying that you are free riders. You Moldovans are free riders. You have to thank Ukraine for that. You have to thank Russia for that. Because if there was no war, you wouldn't get a candidate country status. And we also hear this type of criticisms coming from our Western Balkan colleagues and friends, saying that, well, we waited for 20 years and you got candidate countries like in 3 months. For us, it took years. And my answer to my friends from Western Balkans was, guys, thanks to Ukraine, the enlargement process in Western Balkans revigorated. Because we had a lot of the decisions taken by the EU towards Western Balkans, advancing the accession talks and process with all countries that were performing. So I think this is the reality of the present. I was saying that I will talk about peace and war. Well, the war very much shapes the overall, shifts of attitudes, of positions. It didn't only affect security architecture in the region, in Europe, in the world. It changed perceptions and perspectives. Moldova is the most affected country after Ukraine due to Russia's aggression, and even though we don't see an immediate threat, a conventional attack from Russia, because Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people are, by defending themselves, they defend us as well. And for that matter, I think Ukraine defends the whole Europe today. And also Ukraine makes the whole Europe to rethink its policies in terms of security and defense, and not only trying to reach consensus to enlarge and to increase the support for Ukraine, but also looking into your own policies of security and defense. And this is how the idea of strategic autonomy of France now is becoming more and more realistic in the debate about EU thinking about its security and defense. Because the attempt to ignore Russia's expansionist endeavors and Russia's hybrid warfare waged in Europe for many years with the attempt not to provoke Russia by enlarging to the east, EU has not reached its objective because Russia actually was not provoked. But what Russia looked at EU as a weak player, and when no responses came, they just expanded. And they're now threatening not only Ukraine, they're threatening the whole of the Europe. Ignoring Russia was not a good idea, as ignoring Hitler was not a good idea. And basically we see now a spiral of the history today. And I really hope that leaders in Europe learn from that history. But I was talking about the war, and yes, we see a hybrid warfare, and that's systemic. I mean, we face not only disinformation or cyber attacks, we face a very brutal, cynical attack of our democratic institutions by Russia through proxies. They just fund criminals, proxies, and trying to use democratic processes by both challenging them, discrediting them, but also using them to try to get to power, to loyalize, to become loyal, to get into power, to loyalize the country towards Russia, and to use Moldova, a loyalized Moldova, like Belarus, against Ukraine and against Europe. That's what's happening today. So these things are stakes which I think more and more people understand in all of Europe. This is exactly why a part of great support that Ukraine is receiving, and I think Ukraine needs even more support now, even more, Moldova is also getting support in building up resilient institutions, in reviewing and building our security and defense, ability to resist and to counter disinformation, ability to strengthen our critical infrastructure, cyber security, and increase our democratic institutions, and also clean our system from corrupt elites and traitors, because the system, unfortunately, for years has been vulnerabilized. We had in government politicians that have been loyal to Russia And instead of investing in our defense and security, they were using the neutrality clause as an excuse why we should not have investing in our defense and security. And for years, our security and defense budget was 47 million euros 2 years ago. Today, thanks to the European Peace Facility, our budget has been doubled, and next year it will be tripled, and so on and so forth. But still, it's not enough. We have still to invest a lot. Today, even more, we have to invest a lot, not only in our defense capacities, but more we have to invest in our society, societal resilience, institutions, to clean them from corrupt elites which are being used against the state by Russia's proxies. So we see a war, it's an invisible war in my country. This war is happening in Europe as well. And what we see today in the results of the elections, where you see the extreme right winning grounds and so on and so forth, this is a result of an invisible war that Russia is waging for years. And the belief that this can be ignored and this will not produce impact is not true. It's producing impact. So either you face it, you confront it, or you become complacent and realize that you are powerless and just accept this, like it happened at the beginning of the 20th century. So today, I think it's very important to confront this. And I think discussing about how Russia is waging this hybrid warfare and reflecting about it is very important. But I think it's time to act, to see how effectively to counter disinformation with effective measures, to see how to build up resilient institutions in the European Union, and to see how to strike a perfect balance between democracy, human rights, and security. Because what it is at stake in the European Union, as we see it from Moldova, because we see it, is our security, it's our democracy. So I think this is also an answer about the future. It's not about the future of enlargement, it's about the future of the European Union. Today, more actual question. So I think this means that we all together have to realize how we can become more resilient, more resistant, and how we can confront the vulnerabilities and the challenges within our own houses, and see how we can strike, common sense unity within the EU, and create mechanisms to isolate and to limit the power of those who act on behalf of Russia in our countries. Thank you.